Old, reliable, but knowingly ugly. Yet, how can such an ugly tank be loved by so many people around the world? Hi, welcome back to this week's episode of Tanks. And today, we will be discussing the M60 Main Battle Tank, or MBT. The M60 was introduced in 1960 in order to replace the aging M48 Patton III, a tank of which was becoming more and more obsolete against Russian tanks. This tank was used heavily for the next 30 years, being improved into newer variants along the way. Countries such as Egypt, Israel, and Taiwan have and still use this tank today as a means for their own main battle tank. However, in the United States, it was replaced in the 1990s by the M1 Abrams. But that's enough about the history. Let's move on to its firepower. The M60 has a M2 Browning in the commander's cupola, and one M240 for the gunner's coax. But the main cannon, the M68 105mm rifled cannon, had been revolutionary for the time. It was capable of firing high explosive anti-tank fin stabilized rounds, or a round that shoots and melted metals into the tank. It was also capable of firing armor-piercing, fin-stabilized discarding sabot, which was a needle-like round meant to destroy tanks and other armored targets. Now let's move on to the inside of the tank. This tank was crewed by 4 men. The driver, who sat in the center forward hole, the loader, who stood on the left side of the turret, the gunner, who sat in front of the commander and behind the driver, and the commander, who sat relatively higher than everyone else, and that's because of the cupola that he sat in. Now, this configuration of a 4-man crew would further be used in the M1 Abrams, which is very similar in design. Now let's move on to the armor. The M60 uses a cast hull and cast turret. In comparison to the welded plates found in the M3A1 Stuart light tank, the M60 has less weak points in welds, for reasons being there are no welds in said corners. This is because the armor is one single plate, which reduces those welding points significantly. However, like all tanks, the sides, rear, and the turret are major weak points for this tank. Even further, the commander's cupola, although offering great protection against small arms fire, is inadequate against tank rounds, such as the armor-piercing, fin-stabilized discarding sabot, or heat rounds. However, this armor was fair enough in fighting other tanks of the time, as some of the tanks only shot armor-piercing rounds used by World War II style projectiles. The gun method also provided for extra amounts of armor. as depicted here. But as for all American tanks, modern American tanks, the neck is a major weak spot of this tank, only providing roughly 114 millimeters of thick armor. Now let's move on to the suspension. The suspension uses a torsion bar which it pivots upon, as seen in the right side of the wheel. That is where the torsion bar resides. The torsion bar, once spun, immediately snaps back when resistance is relieved, as depicted here. The torsion bar suspension system is also used on other tanks, such as the Leopards, found in Germany, the Russian T series, and the M48. Now let's move on to its stabilizer, of which this model has none. The M60 was outfitted with no stabilizer at the time, and as depicted here, I am moving relatively at a slow pace, and my zero is not messed up. However, when I move horizontally or laterally, the zero seems to shake up a whole lot. And this is due to the non-existent stabilizer on the horizontal side as well. And as depicted here, as I speed up the tank, the zero is significantly messed up, and I cannot fire at my target properly. This issue was solved with its later variants, such as the M60 A1, AOS, or add-on stabilization. Now let us review. Today we talked about the M60 Main Battle Tank, a fairly well made tank, and a universal tank being used by many different countries around the world. It offered greater firepower in comparison to the M48s and other weaker tanks of each nation, and it offered greater protection than World War II tanks and other Korean War tanks. However, it still has weaknesses as much as any other tank, found in the sides and in the commander's capital. Thank you for watching this episode of Tanks.